The woman left behind. The wagon wheel shattered like a gunshot in the mud, and Eleanor Whitford knew, with the cold certainty that comes just before disaster, that her husband wasn't coming back. Rain hammered the canvas above her infant son's cradle as James rode into the storm an hour ago, promising to hunt, taking their only horse and the lockbox that held everything they owned. The wagon master's lantern swung toward her through the downpour, and she saw it in his face before he spoke. The train couldn't wait. 200 souls or one woman with a baby. The choice had already been made. If you want to know whether Eleanor survived the Montana wilderness, whether justice found the man who abandoned her, and whether love can grow from the ruins of betrayal, stay with this story until the end. And please, leave a comment with your city so I can see how far Eleanor's journey travels. The storm had teeth. Eleanor felt them in the wind that clawed at the wagon canvas, in the rain that found every seam and gap, in the cold that crept through wool and skin until it settled in her bones. She held Thomas against her chest, his small body wrapped in every dry blanket she could find, and listened to the world tear itself apart outside. The wagon train had been moving since dawn, wheels churning through mud that sucked at every spoke and rim. They'd been making poor time for days, 15 miles when they should have covered 20, 12 when they needed 15. The weather had turned vicious 3 days out of Fort Benton, and the Missouri breaks offered no shelter, only endless rolling hills of grass and stone beneath a sky the color of old iron. When the wheel broke, Eleanor had been nursing Thomas, trying to keep him quiet so the other families wouldn't hear him fuss. The crack split the air like rifle fire, and the wagon lurched sideways, spilling her onto the rough plank floor. She caught herself on one arm, keeping Thomas cradled and safe, tasting blood where her teeth had cut her lip. James had been walking alongside, leading their horse. She heard him curse, saw him circle to examine the damage. The wheel had split clean through 2 spokes, the iron rim bent and useless. "How long to fix it?" she called through the canvas opening. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice carried an edge she'd learned to recognize over their 8 months of marriage, the tone that meant his mind was already moving toward an exit. Hours, maybe longer in this mud. The train can't wait for every broken wheel between here and the coast. He was already unhitching their horse, his movements quick and purposeful. "I'll ride ahead, see if I can find game. We'll need provisions if we're stuck here." Eleanor shifted Thomas to her shoulder, peering out through the rain. "James?" the wagon master said. I know what he said. His hands worked the leather straps with practiced efficiency. "I'll be back before they miss us." But she saw him lift the small wooden lockbox from beneath the driver's seat, the one that held their money, the deed to her father's watch, the few pieces of jewelry she'd inherited from her mother, saw him secure it to the saddle with rope. "Why are you taking that? Safer with me than sitting in a broken wagon." He swung into the saddle, his hat pulled low against the driving rain. "Keep the boy quiet. I'll be back." He rode east, away from the train's direction of travel, and something in Eleanor's chest pulled tight and cold. The wagon master came 20 minutes later, his face grim beneath the brim of his hat, water streaming from his oilcloth coat. "Mrs. Whitford, I need you to understand our position." She understood before he finished speaking, understood from the way he wouldn't quite meet her eyes, from the set of his shoulders, from the fact that he'd come alone instead of bringing men to help repair the wheel. "We have 240 souls in this train, ma'am, 18 wagons. If this storm gets worse, and it will, we need to reach the Musselshell crossing before the river rises. That's another day's travel at best. My husband went to hunt. He'll be back soon." Something flickered in the wagon master's weathered face, pity, perhaps, or recognition. "Ma'am, I've led 11 trains across this territory. I've seen men ride off for a lot of reasons, and I've learned to know which ones come back." The words hit like stones. Eleanor pulled Thomas closer, feeling his small heart beat against her ribs. "You're leaving us." "I'm leaving the wagon. You and the child can ride with the Hendersons. They've got space in their rig. But we can't wait for the wheel to be fixed, and we can't wait for a man who—" He trailed off, rain dripping from his nose. "We can't wait, Mrs. Whitford. I'm sorry. Our supplies are in this wagon, everything we own. Take what you can carry, but we're moving out in 15 minutes. He left her there, in the tilted wagon, with the rain hammering overhead, and her son beginning to fuss with hunger. She tried to think, tried to plan, but her mind kept circling back to James's face as he'd ridden away. The relief in it, the freedom. 8 months married, and she'd spent most of them learning the architecture of his lies. The courtship had been brief. She was 23, teaching school in St. Louis, caring for her aging father in a boarding house that smelled of cabbage and coal smoke. James Whitford had been handsome, charming, full of talk about Oregon and opportunity and the life they'd build together. Her father had died 2 weeks before the wedding, leaving her alone in the world except for this man who promised her everything. She'd believed him because she'd needed to, because the alternative was a future teaching other people's children while her own youth drained away in rented rooms and borrowed dreams. Now, sitting in the broken wagon with Thomas crying against her shoulder, Eleanor understood what her instincts had been whispering for months. James Whitford was the kind of man who collected futures the way other men collected debts, and when the payment came due, he simply moved on to the next mark. She fed Thomas, changed his diaper, wrapped him in dry clothes she pulled from the trunk. Her hands moved automatically while her mind raced through calculations. The Hendersons' wagon was already crowded, 6 children under 10, the oldest boy coughing with something that sounded like pneumonia. Mrs. Henderson had kind eyes but exhausted hands, and her husband had that hollow look men got when they realized they'd brought their family into wilderness that didn't care about good intentions. Could she really crowd into their space, another mouth to feed, another body taking up precious room? And if James did come back, if she'd misjudged him, would he know where to find her in a train of 18 wagons? The questions tangled in her chest like briars. The wagon master's whistle cut through the storm, the signal to move out. Eleanor heard the other wagons creaking into motion, heard the teamsters calling to their oxen, heard the Hendersons' oldest girl crying about leaving her doll behind. She waited for hoofbeats, for James to appear through the rain with game across his saddle and apologies on his lips. The sounds of the train faded into the storm. Darkness came early, swallowed by clouds that turned the afternoon into premature night. Eleanor lit the small lamp, rationing the oil, and inventoried what they had. A trunk of clothes, 2 blankets, a bag of cornmeal, some dried beef, a canteen. The money was gone. The deed to her father's watch was gone. The jewelry was gone. Her husband was gone. Thomas slept fitfully, waking every hour to nurse, his small face scrunched with discomfort. The wagon offered some shelter from the rain, but the wind found every gap, and the temperature was dropping. Eleanor wrapped herself around her son, sharing what warmth her body could provide, and tried not to think about what would happen when the lamp oil ran out, when the food ran out, when the storm finally tore the wagon canvas apart. She must have dozed, because she woke to Thomas screaming and a different quality to the darkness. The rain had intensified into something biblical, hammering the wagon with such force that she could barely hear her own thoughts. Water was pooling on the floor, running through gaps she hadn't noticed before. Eleanor struggled upright, her body stiff with cold, and realized the wagon was tilting at a steeper angle. The broken wheel had sunk deeper into mud that was now more like a river, and the whole structure was listing dangerously to one side. She grabbed Thomas in the blankets, her heart hammering, trying to think through the panic. If the wagon tipped, if it rolled, they could be crushed beneath it. But outside was only darkness and storm and wilderness that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. The canvas tore with a sound like ripping cloth, and suddenly rain was pouring in, soaking everything, turning the wagon bed into a shallow pool. Eleanor clutched Thomas to her chest and made for the opening, knowing only that they couldn't stay inside something that was actively trying to kill them. The mud grabbed at her boots the moment she stepped down. It was knee-deep, thick as porridge, and the rain was falling so hard she couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. The wagon lurched behind her, groaning as it settled deeper, and she staggered away from it, terrified it would topple and trap her beneath. Where could she go? There was no shelter, no landmark, nothing but darkness and water and the howling wind. Thomas was screaming now, his cries barely audible over the storm, and Eleanor felt something break loose in her chest. Not panic, but a clarity born of absolute desperation. She would not let her son die in the Montana mud because a man had chosen money over family. She would not let this storm, this wilderness, this whole vast uncaring territory decide their fate. Rise in the land, a cluster of rocks, a tree that might offer protection, and saw a light. At first she thought she'd imagined it, a trick of lightning or exhaustion. But no, there it was again, steady and golden, bobbing through the darkness like a star fallen to earth. A lantern. Someone was coming. Hope and terror warred in her chest. Stories of what happened to women alone in the wilderness flooded her mind. Stories she'd heard whispered in boarding houses and read in newspapers back when the world had been civilized and distant from this brutal reality. But Thomas was still screaming, and the cold was stealing the feeling from her feet, and she had run out of choices. The light drew closer, and behind it emerged a figure on horseback, a man in a long coat, hat pulled low, features obscured by rain and shadow. He stopped 15 feet away, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Eleanor stood there in the mud, soaked to the skin, holding her crying infant, and waited for whatever came next. The man dismounted, moving carefully, keeping his hands visible. "You're from the wagon train." It wasn't a question. His voice was rough but not unkind, with the flat vowels of someone who'd grown up far from cities. "They left us." Eleanor had to shout over the storm. "The wheel broke. They couldn't wait." "Us?" He stepped closer, and the lantern light caught his face, weathered, early 40s perhaps, with the kind of features that came from mixed heritage and hard living. His eyes were dark and steady, assessing the situation with the quick efficiency of someone who'd made a lot of decisions in bad weather. "My son and me." He looked past her to the tilting wagon, taking in the broken wheel, the torn canvas, the hopeless angle of the whole enterprise. When his gaze returned to her, something had shifted in it. "Your husband?" "Rode off to hunt. Hours ago." The man nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "You can't stay here. Wagon's going to roll within the hour, and this draw will flood when the real rain hits." "This isn't the real rain?" A ghost of something that might have been humor touched his mouth. "Ma'am, this is just the warning. The real storm is still building east. You've got maybe an hour before this whole area becomes a river." Eleanor felt her knees weaken. "What do I do?" He studied her for another long moment, and she saw the calculation in his eyes. The weighing of risk and burden, of obligation and survival. Whatever he decided would determine whether she and Thomas lived or died. The power of it sat between them like a third presence in the storm. "My ranch is 2 miles west. You and the boy can shelter there until this blows over." "I can't. I don't even know your name." "Caleb Monroe." He moved to his horse, a big bay that stood steady despite the storm, and began adjusting the saddle. "And you can't do a lot of things, ma'am, but dying in the mud doesn't have to be one of them." He was right, and they both knew it. Eleanor looked back at the wagon one last time, at everything she owned disappearing into the Montana darkness, and made her choice. "My name is Eleanor Whitford. This is Thomas. He's 6 months old." "Can you ride?" "Not well. Not with him." Caleb swung back into the saddle, then reached down. "Give him to me." Everything in her resisted, handing her child to a stranger in the middle of a storm, trusting his life to unfamiliar hands. But Thomas was crying with cold and fear, and her arms were shaking with exhaustion, and there was no good choice left, only the least terrible one. She passed Thomas up, watching as Caleb tucked him inside his coat with practiced efficiency, securing the bundle against his chest with one arm. "Now you," he said, extending his free hand. Eleanor grabbed it and felt herself hauled upward with surprising strength. She landed awkwardly behind the saddle, nearly sliding off the other side before Caleb's hand steadied her. "Hold on to my belt. Don't let go, no matter what." She wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling Thomas's small form pressed between them, and held on as Caleb turned the horse west into the driving rain. The ride was nightmare and salvation mixed together. The horse picked its way through darkness and mud, Caleb guiding it with small shifts of weight and quiet words she couldn't hear over the storm. Eleanor clung to him, her face pressed against his back, trying to keep her seat on the rain-slicked leather. Thomas's cries had faded to whimpers, muffled by the coat, and she prayed he was still breathing, still warm, still alive. Time lost meaning. They could have ridden for 20 minutes or 2 hours. Eleanor had no way to measure it except in the growing numbness of her hands and the desperate ache in her legs from gripping the horse. Then, through the rain, she saw shapes emerging, buildings, fences, the solid geometry of human construction in the wilderness. A barn loomed up on their left, and Caleb guided the horse toward it, dismounting before they'd fully stopped. "Inside, Visis," he said, reaching up for Thomas first, then offering his hand to Eleanor. She half fell from the saddle, her legs buckling when they hit solid ground. Caleb caught her with his free arm, keeping her upright while he pushed open the barn door and guided her into darkness that smelled of hay and horses and blessed dryness. He set the lantern on a hook, then carefully extracted Thomas from his coat. The baby was quiet now, his eyes wide and solemn in the lamplight, and when Caleb passed him back to Eleanor, she felt the warmth still radiating from her son's small body. "He's all right?" "Just scared, like his mother." Caleb was already moving, pulling saddle and tack from the horse with efficient movements. "There's a house through that door. Get yourselves inside and dry. I'll be there shortly." Eleanor hesitated, suddenly aware that she was about to enter a stranger's home, that she knew nothing about this man except that he'd chosen to help when he could have ridden past. "Why?" The question emerged before she could stop it. "Why did you come looking?" Caleb paused in his work, his hands still on the saddle. "Saw the train pass my fence line this afternoon. Counted the wagons. Counted them again an hour later on the way back. They were one short. You went looking for the missing wagon. Went looking to see if someone needed help." He resumed his work, not meeting her eyes. "Turns out someone did. Now get inside before you both catch your death." The house was small but solid. Log walls chinked against the wind, a stone fireplace that radiated blessed heat, simple furniture that looked handmade but sturdy. Eleanor stood dripping on the wooden floor, unsure what to do or touch, holding Thomas against her soaked dress. A woman's coat hung on a peg by the door. Women's curtains framed the windows. A delicate china cup sat on the mantel beside rougher pottery mugs. Eleanor's stomach clenched. A wife. Of course there was a wife. Caleb came through the door, carrying her sodden trunk. He set it near the fire, then glanced around the room, seeing where her gaze had landed. "My wife died 3 years ago. Fever took her between one sunrise and the next." His voice was matter-of-fact, reporting information without asking for sympathy. "There's a bedroom through that door. Used to be ours. You and the boy take it tonight. I'll sleep out here." "Mr. Monroe, I can't." "You can and you will, because arguing about it wastes heat and time, and your son needs both." He moved to a chest, pulling out folded fabric. These were Sarah's. She was about your size. Get out of those wet clothes before pneumonia gets a vote in this conversation. He thrust the bundle into her arms. A nightgown, wool stockings, a heavy shawl, then turned his back and busied himself building up the fire. Eleanor stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by kindness from a stranger who owed her nothing, given freely without calculation or expectation. It had been so long since anyone had helped her without wanting something in return that she'd forgotten what it felt like. "Thank you," she whispered. Caleb didn't turn around. "Thank me by getting warm." The bedroom was small and spare. A bed with a thick quilt, a washstand with pitcher and basin, pegs on the wall for clothes. Everything was clean but worn, well-maintained but clearly unused except for the purpose of maintenance itself. Eleanor peeled off her wet clothes with shaking hands, then stripped Thomas down and rubbed him briskly with a dry towel she found folded on the washstand. His skin was pink and healthy beneath the dirt and rain, and when she checked him over, everything seemed whole and unharmed. He nursed hungrily while she changed into the borrowed nightgown, and the simple animal comfort of it, warmth, dryness, her child fed and safe, brought tears she'd been holding back since James rode away. She let herself cry quietly while Thomas nursed, let the fear and betrayal and desperate uncertainty of the last 6 hours pour out in silent sobs that shook her shoulders. Then she wiped her face, wrapped her son in the shawl, and carried him back to the main room. Caleb had set a pot of something on the stove. Soup, by the smell of it. He'd also spread her wet clothes near the fire to dry, arranging them with an efficiency that spoke of long practice doing such tasks alone. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of two chairs at the simple table. You need food. I can help. You can sit down before you fall down. He ladled soup into a bowl, something with beans and meat and vegetables, thick enough to stand a spoon in. When's the last time you ate? Eleanor had to think about it. Yesterday morning? Maybe. He set the bowl in front of her, then returned with a cup of water and a thick slice of bread. Eat slow. Your stomach won't thank you for rushing. She obeyed, taking small bites while Thomas dozed against her shoulder. The soup was simple but good, seasoned with salt and something herbal she couldn't identify. Each spoonful brought a little more warmth, a little more clarity, until she felt almost human again. Caleb ate standing up, leaning against the counter, watching the storm through the window. Now that they were both inside and dry, Eleanor could see him more clearly. Tall, lean in the way men got from hard work rather than deliberate effort, with broad shoulders and calloused hands. His face had the weathered quality of someone who spent most of their time outdoors, carved by sun and wind into something past handsome but not without appeal. There was silver threading through his dark hair at the temples, and a scar ran along his left jawline, old enough to have faded to white. "How did you know where to find us?" she asked. "Didn't, exactly. But wagon trains follow the same routes, and there's only so many places a wagon breaks down between here and Fort Benton. I rode the likely spots until I found you." "You could have been killed in that storm." He shrugged. "Could have been killed 100 times in this territory. Hasn't happened yet." "Still, you risked your life for strangers." "I risked a cold ride for someone who needed help." He turned from the window, his expression unreadable. "Not the same thing." Eleanor studied him, trying to understand what manner of man rode into deadly storms to rescue people he'd never met. In her experience, men did things for reasons, for money, for pride, for leverage. But Caleb Monroe had asked for nothing, expected nothing, offered everything he had without hesitation. It made her profoundly uneasy. "My husband," she said carefully, "took our money when he rode off. Everything we had. I can't pay you for this." "Didn't ask you to." "What do you want, then?" The question came out harsher than she'd intended, born from 8 months of learning that every kindness had a price. Caleb's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, recognition, perhaps, of what it meant that she had to ask. "I want you and your son to be warm and dry and safe until this storm passes. After that, you can go wherever you need to go." He set his empty bowl in the basin. "But right now, what I want is for you to finish eating and get some sleep. We can talk about the rest in daylight." He moved toward the door, pulling on his still damp coat. "Where are you going?" "Check the horses. Make sure the barn roof is holding. I'll be back shortly." He left before she could argue, and Eleanor sat alone in the warm kitchen, holding her sleeping son, trying to reconcile the world she'd known, where men took and lied and left you stranded in storms, with this new reality where strangers risked death to offer shelter. Outside, the storm hammered at the walls, and somewhere in the darkness, James Whitford was riding away with everything she'd once believed about love and marriage and the promises people made. But here, in this small ranch house in the Montana Territory, Eleanor Whitford held her son close and tasted soup flavored with salt and kindness, and felt something she hadn't felt since before her father died. She felt the possibility of hope. When Caleb returned an hour later, shaking rain from his coat and adding wood to the fire, Eleanor was still sitting at the table, unable to quite make herself move toward the bedroom and sleep. "Storm's getting worse," he said quietly. "We're in for a rough night, but the house has weathered worse, and the barn is solid. How long will it last? Day? Maybe 2. Hard to say." He hung his coat to dry, then moved around the room with the easy familiarity of someone who'd performed these evening rituals 1,000 times. Banking the fire, checking the windows, setting out the lamp for morning. "You should sleep while you can. Morning comes early on a ranch." "I don't know how to repay this." "Then don't." He paused, meeting her eyes in the lamplight. "Mrs. Whitford, I've lived in this territory for 15 years. I've seen what happens to people the wilderness decides to test. Sometimes they survive, sometimes they don't, but it's rarely about what they deserve. You needed help. I could give it. That's the whole calculation." Where I come from, nobody does anything without expecting something back. Then maybe you're not where you come from anymore. He gestured toward the bedroom. Get some rest. Tomorrow you can start figuring out what comes next. Eleanor carried Thomas to the bedroom and laid him carefully in the center of the big bed, building a nest of pillows and blankets around him so he couldn't roll. Then she climbed in beside him, pulling the heavy quilt over them both, and listened to the storm rage outside walls that, for tonight at least, were keeping them safe. Through the door, she could hear Caleb moving around the main room, settling in for the night. The sounds were domestic, ordinary, almost peaceful, and Eleanor realized with a start that she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt this safe in the presence of a man. James had been charming, but there had always been an edge to it, a performance quality that made rest impossible. Even in their marriage bed, she'd never quite been able to let down her guard. But here, in a stranger's house, listening to Caleb Monroe prepare for sleep in the next room, Eleanor found herself relaxing despite everything. Her body recognized what her mind was still learning. She was safe here. Thomas was safe here. For tonight, that was enough. She closed her eyes and let exhaustion pull her under, into dreams of storms and broken wagons and hands reaching through darkness to pull her toward solid ground. Morning arrived not with sunshine, but with a different quality of gray, lighter, softer, the storm's fury spent into steady rain. Eleanor woke to unfamiliar silence, the kind that comes from solid walls and distance from cities, and for a moment couldn't remember where she was. Then Thomas stirred beside her, and memory flooded back. The broken wagon, James riding away, the storm, Caleb Monroe materializing from darkness like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known how to speak. She dressed quickly in her own clothes, now dry and stiff from hanging by the fire, and carried Thomas into the main room. Caleb was already up, coffee brewing on the stove, the smell of it rich and bitter in the cool morning air. "There's bread in the box," he said without turning around. "Butter's in the crock by the window. Help yourself." Eleanor shifted Thomas to one hip and moved to the simple cupboard, finding what she needed with the awkwardness of someone navigating another woman's kitchen. Sarah's kitchen, she reminded herself. 3 years dead, but still present in the careful arrangement of cups, the worn spot on the floor by the stove, the delicate stitching on the dish towels. "How long did the storm last?" she asked, slicing bread with a knife that was sharp enough to speak of recent care. "Stopped about an hour before dawn. Creek's up, but not flooding. We were lucky." Lucky. The word sat strange in Eleanor's mouth, given everything that had happened. But she supposed it was true. Lucky the wagon had broken where Caleb could find them. Lucky the storm hadn't killed them before he arrived. Lucky to be alive and warm with food in front of her instead of dead in the Montana mud. She fed Thomas while Caleb moved around the kitchen with the efficient quiet of someone who'd lived alone for years. He didn't ask questions, didn't press for conversation, simply existed in the space with a self-sufficiency that Eleanor found both comforting and unsettling. Men in her experience were either aggressively present or conspicuously absent. Her father had filled every room with opinions and needs. James had been all charm and demands. But Caleb inhabited his own life without requiring witnesses or validation, and she didn't quite know what to make of it. "The wagon train," she said finally. "How far ahead would they be?" Caleb poured coffee into 2 cups, set one in front of her. "Day and a half, maybe 2 days, depending on the mud. They'll be pushing hard for the crossing." "Could we catch them?" He met her eyes over the rim of his cup, and she saw him weighing how much truth to give her. "On a good horse, traveling light, maybe. With a baby and no supplies, in mud that'll suck the shoes off a horse? No." The finality of it settled in her chest like stones. "So I'm stranded here." You're here until you decide where you want to go." He set down his cup. "There's a settlement 12 miles south, Silver Creek. About 200 people, general store, church, school. Wagon trains stop there to resupply. If you want to wait for the next one, that'd be the place." "How often do trains come through?" "This time of year, every few weeks, weather permitting. Could be one next week, could be a month." Eleanor did the mathematics in her head. Weeks of waiting, living on charity she couldn't repay, dependent on strangers in a territory that had already taught her how quickly protection could be withdrawn. The thought made her skin crawl. I can work, she said. Charity. Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Approval, perhaps, or respect. Settlement school burned down last winter. They've been trying to rebuild, but funds are short, and the teacher they had moved back east after her husband died. If you're serious about working, they'd likely take you on. Hope sparked in Eleanor's chest, small but real. A job meant money, independence, the ability to make decisions about her own future instead of being buffeted by other people's choices. How would I get there? I'm heading into town later this week to pick up supplies. You and the boy can ride with me, talk to the settlement committee about the teaching position. He refilled his coffee, his movements deliberate. Until then, you're welcome to stay here. There's work enough on a ranch if you want to earn your keep, cooking, mending, general tasks. I don't expect it, but I won't refuse it if you're offering. Eleanor looked around the kitchen, seeing it now with different eyes. The pile of mending in the corner, buttons missing and hems unraveling. The dishes stacked haphazardly, clean but chaotic. The general air of a space maintained for function, but not comfort, inhabited by someone who'd forgotten how to make a home instead of just a shelter. I'll earn my keep, she said firmly. It's the least I can do. Caleb nodded once, accepting the terms. Then we have an arrangement. The days that followed developed a rhythm Eleanor hadn't expected. Caleb rose before dawn to tend the animals and check fences, returning for breakfast that Eleanor learned to have ready: coffee, eggs when the hens cooperated, bread toasted over the fire. He worked through the morning while Eleanor tackled the accumulated disorder of a house that had been functioning but not thriving, then returned at midday for a simple meal before heading back out until supper. In the evenings, they sat at the small table and ate the food Eleanor had prepared from supplies in the cellar: potatoes, onions, the last of the winter squash, preserved meat that Caleb had put up himself. The conversations were sparse, but not uncomfortable, filled with practical information about the ranch, the territory, the realities of survival in a place where winter could kill you and summer could burn you, and spring was just a polite fiction between the two. Eleanor learned that Caleb had come to Montana 15 years ago, following gold rumors that proved hollow, but finding land that proved solid. That he'd built the ranch from nothing, one log and one fence post at a time. That Sarah had been a homesteader's daughter, raised to frontier hardship, who'd taken to ranch life like she was born for it. She was tougher than me, Caleb said one evening, his voice quiet. Could shoot better, ride harder, work longer. I thought we'd have 50 years together. What happened? Fever came through one winter, killed her in 36 hours. I couldn't... He stopped, the sentence unfinished. Didn't matter what I could or couldn't do. She was gone. Eleanor understood the shape of that grief, the way it carved you out and left you hollow, the way it taught you that love was just another form of fragility. She'd felt it when her father died, when the last person who'd known her as a child disappeared and left her alone in the world. I'm sorry, she said, the words inadequate but sincere. Caleb shrugged. Territory takes what it wants. You learn to live with what's left. The words should have been bleak, but somehow they weren't. There was a steadiness to Caleb's grief, an acceptance that didn't mean forgetting, but rather carrying the weight without being crushed by it. Eleanor found herself watching him when he didn't notice, trying to understand how someone survived that kind of loss without becoming bitter or broken. Thomas, for his part, seemed to thrive in the ranch's quiet routine. He slept better in the solid house, ate better with Eleanor's nerves settling, and spent his waking hours watching Caleb with the solemn fascination babies had for new faces. Caleb, in turn, treated the child with the same practical kindness he showed everything else, holding him when Eleanor needed her hands free, talking to him in the same even tone he used with the horses, once even walking the floor with him at 2 a.m. when Thomas woke fussing and Eleanor was too exhausted to rise. You don't have to, she'd said, emerging from the bedroom to find Caleb pacing with Thomas against his shoulder. Go back to sleep, he's fine. But he's a baby who's had a rough week. Doesn't matter whose he is. Caleb's hand patted Thomas's back with surprising gentleness. Sleep, Eleanor. I've got him. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the casual intimacy of it settled in her chest with unexpected warmth. She returned to bed and listened through the door as Caleb walked and murmured to Thomas until the crying stopped, and felt something shift in her understanding of what a man could be. On the 4th day, as Eleanor was mending one of Caleb's shirts, The seams splitting from wear and hard use, a rider appeared on the eastern horizon. Caleb saw him first, standing at the window with his coffee cup frozen halfway to his mouth. "We've got company." Eleanor's hand stilled on the fabric. "Who?" "Can't tell yet, but nobody rides out here unless they're lost or looking for something specific." The rider approached slowly, picking his way through the mud, and as he drew closer, Eleanor felt her stomach drop. She recognized the horse before she recognized the man, a rangy sorrel with 3 white stockings, distinctive enough to be unmistakable. It was one of the horses from the wagon train, and the rider was someone she'd seen before, though she'd never learned his name, a younger man, maybe 25, who'd helped her husband load supplies back in Fort Benton. Caleb stepped out onto the porch, his posture relaxed but alert. Eleanor followed, holding Thomas, her heart hammering. The rider reined in 20 feet from the house, his gaze moving from Caleb to Eleanor with an expression that was difficult to read. "Mrs. Whitford." "Mr. Porter," she said, the name coming back to her suddenly. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for you, actually. Wagon master sent me back to check on you once the storm cleared. Make sure you survived." His attention shifted to Caleb. "Didn't expect to find you'd already been rescued." "Mr. Monroe found us during the storm," Eleanor said. "We would have died without his help." Porter nodded slowly, something calculating in his eyes. "That was fortunate. Real fortunate." He dismounted, moving with the easy confidence of someone used to being welcome. "Any word from your husband?" The question landed like a slap. Eleanor felt her face heat. "No." "Figured as much. Man who rides off in a storm like that." Porter shook his head. "Well, some men aren't built for the responsibilities they take on." Caleb's voice was mild but carried an edge. "You rode 12 miles in bad mud to deliver condolences?" "Rode 12 miles to fulfill my obligation to a member of our train." Porter's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "But since I'm here, I should let Mrs. Whitford know she's got options. The wagon master said if she wanted to rejoin the train, we could make space, but we're camped at Musselshell Crossing for repairs. Be there another 3 days at least." Eleanor's pulse quickened. The train. Her original destination, the future she'd planned before everything fell apart. "That's kind of him," she managed. "Of course, there'd be the matter of expenses, feeding an extra mouth, taking up space in someone's wagon. Normal fee for a passenger is $50 to Oregon." "I don't have $50. My husband took everything when he left." Porter's expression turned sympathetic in a way that made Eleanor's skin crawl. "Well, now that is a problem. But I'm sure we could work something out. A woman with your education, your refinement. There's always ways for resourceful people to manage expenses." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor felt Caleb go very still beside her. "I think," Caleb said quietly, "you've delivered your message, Mr. Porter. Safe travels back to your train." Porter's smile hardened. "Just trying to help a lady in distress. No need to be unfriendly about it." "Wasn't being unfriendly. I'm being clear. Mrs. Whitford is under my protection while she's on my land. If the wagon master has legitimate business to discuss, he can ride out here himself. But you've said your piece, and now it's time for you to leave." For a moment, Eleanor thought Porter might argue. His jaw tightened, and his hand drifted toward the gun at his hip, a gesture so casual it might have been unconscious, but Caleb noticed. His own posture shifted subtly, weight balanced, hands loose at his sides. "No offense meant," Porter said finally, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "Just doing my Christian duty." "Noted. Now, do it somewhere else." Porter remounted with deliberate slowness, making it clear he was leaving by choice rather than compulsion. "Mrs. Whitford, if you change your mind about rejoining the train, we'll be at the crossing through Friday. After that, you're on your own." He rode off without waiting for a response, and Eleanor watched him go with a mixture of relief and unease. When he disappeared over the rise, she turned to find Caleb watching her with an unreadable expression. "I didn't ask him to come," she said. "I know. And I wasn't going to." Whatever he was implying, I know that too. Caleb's voice was gentle. "Eleanor, you don't owe me explanations. But you should know that men like Porter are common enough in this territory. They see women alone and think it means women available. Best to make your position clear early. What is my position? The question emerged before she could stop it, raw and uncertain. What was she to Caleb Monroe? Guest? Burden? Employee? Something else she didn't have words for? Caleb met her eyes steadily. You're someone who needed help and got it. That's all. But while you're here, you're under this roof, and that means something. Means you're not alone, not unprotected, not available for whatever arrangements men like Porter want to propose. And after? When I leave for Silver Creek? Then you'll be the new school teacher, and you'll have a reputation and a position of your own. Different kind of protection, but protection all the same. He gestured toward the house. Come on, coffee's getting cold and there's work to do. They went inside, but Eleanor's mind kept circling back to Porter's visit, to the implications of his offer, to the reality of what her life could have been if Caleb hadn't found her in that storm. She'd been so focused on survival that she hadn't fully processed how precarious her position was. Alone, penniless, with a baby, in a territory where women were scarce and men's intentions weren't always honorable. That night, after supper, as they sat by the fire with Thomas asleep in the bedroom, Eleanor found herself asking the question that had been building all day. Why did you really come looking for us? Caleb looked up from the harness he was mending. Told you. Train was short a wagon. But you didn't know me. Didn't know if I was worth the risk. Didn't need to know you. Needed to know someone might be in trouble. He set down his work. Eleanor, I've seen what this territory does to people who get left behind. Seen the graves, seen the remains. If there was a chance someone was alive and stranded, I couldn't just sit here drinking coffee and pretending I didn't know. Most people would have. Then most people are fine with living in a world where children die in storms because nobody thought it was their business to check. His voice was quiet but firm. I'm not fine with that. Never have been. Eleanor studied him in the firelight, this man who'd rearranged his life to shelter strangers, who asked for nothing in return, who seemed to operate from some internal code that had nothing to do with profit or recognition. In St. Louis, she would have been suspicious of such behavior. But here, watching Caleb's hands work the leather with patient skill, she found herself believing that some people really did help simply because they could. I'll pay you back, she said. Once I have the teaching position, once I'm earning money, I'll pay you for the food, the shelter, everything. Don't want your money. Then what do you want? Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his hand still on the harness. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. I want you to build a life where you don't owe anyone anything, where you make choices because they're what you want, not because you're trading for protection or paying off debts. He looked at her directly. I want you to be free, Eleanor. That's all. The words settled over her like a blanket, warm and unexpected. She'd spent so long thinking of freedom as something to be earned or bartered for, something men gave and women paid for in 1,000 subtle ways. But Caleb spoke of it like it was a birthright, something she deserved simply by existing. I don't know if I know how to do that, she admitted. Then you'll learn. You're smart, capable, stronger than you think you are. You'll figure it out. Eleanor wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe she could be the kind of woman who stood on her own, who made decisions from strength rather than fear. But the weight of her marriage to James, the betrayal of it, still sat heavy in her chest. Can I ask you something? Caleb nodded. When Sarah died, did you ever think about remarrying, finding someone else? Thought about it, he admitted. Had a few opportunities over the years, but none of them felt right. Felt like I'd be asking someone to fill a space that was carved out for someone else, and that's not fair to anyone. So you've been alone for 3 years. Alone's not the same as lonely. I've got the ranch, got neighbors when I need company, got a life that suits me fine most days. He returned to his mending. Maybe someday that'll change, but I'm not looking to force it. Eleanor understood what he wasn't saying, that he'd rather be alone than settle for something less than what he'd lost. There was a dignity in that, a refusal to compromise simply because compromise was convenient. They sat in companionable silence while the fire burned low, and Eleanor found herself thinking about the future she'd imagined when she married James. She'd pictured a home in Oregon, children, respectability, security. All the things she'd been raised to want, all the markers of a successful woman's life. But that future had been built on lies, and it had crumbled the moment James rode away with their money. Now sitting in Caleb Monroe's quiet ranch house, watching him work leather by firelight while her son slept safe in the next room, Eleanor found herself imagining a different kind of future. One where she taught other people's children and earned her own money and made her own decisions. One where she answered to no one but herself. It terrified her. It thrilled her. It felt like standing at the edge of something vast and unknown. "Caleb?" she said softly. "Thank you for everything, but especially for treating me like I'm capable of handling my own life." He looked up, and in his dark eyes she saw understanding of what it meant to be underestimated, to have your strength questioned, to be offered help that came with hooks attached. "You are capable," he said simply. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The next morning brought a visitor of a different kind. Eleanor was hanging laundry, Caleb's shirts and her own dresses, Thomas's small garments that looked impossibly tiny strung on the line, when she heard the sound of wheels and looked up to see a wagon approaching. A woman sat on the driver's bench, handling the reins with easy competence, a large basket beside her. She was perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair pulled back severely and the kind of face that came from decades of frontier life, weathered but not unkind, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Caleb emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his pants. "Mrs. Garrett, wasn't expecting you. Figured you wouldn't be. But news travels fast in this territory, and when I heard you'd taken in a stranded woman and baby, I thought I'd come see for myself." The woman's gaze moved to Eleanor with frank assessment. "I'm Martha Garrett, run the general store in Silver Creek." Eleanor set down the laundry basket. "Eleanor Whitford. It's nice to meet you." Whitford, that was the name Porter mentioned when he came through yesterday. Said he'd found you here, all cozy with Caleb. Martha's tone was neutral, but her eyes were sharp. Course, Porter's got a mouth that runs faster than his brain, so I wanted to get the truth of things before the gossip got too far ahead of the facts. Eleanor felt her face heat. "It's not what he implied. Mr. Monroe rescued me from the storm. That's all." "That's what I figured, knowing Caleb. But folks talk, and in a settlement the size of Silver Creek, talk matters." Martha climbed down from the wagon with surprising agility. "Brought you some things, proper women's clothes, supplies for the baby, some food items. Figured you lost everything when you got separated from the train." "I can't accept—" "You can and you will, because I'm not hauling this all back to town." Martha pulled the basket from the wagon. "Besides, these are practical matters. Can't have the new schoolteacher looking like a refugee when she meets the settlement committee." Eleanor blinked. "How did you know about that?" "Honey, Caleb sent word 3 days ago that he might be bringing a qualified teacher to town. The committee's been beside themselves with excitement ever since." Martha carried the basket toward the house. "Now let's see what we're working with." Inside, Martha unpacked the basket with brisk efficiency. 2 practical dresses in dark colors, a good wool shawl, undergarments that had clearly been worn but were clean and serviceable, several cloth diapers for Thomas, a small stuffed rabbit, and a wrapped bundle that turned out to be fresh bread and butter. "The dresses were my daughter's," Martha explained. "She moved to Denver last year, married a banker, left half her wardrobe behind. You look about her size." "Mrs. Garrett, I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me. Thank Caleb for sending word, and thank yourself for being brave enough to start over in a place that doesn't owe you anything." Martha's expression softened slightly. "I know what it's like, honey. Came to this territory myself 20 years ago after my first husband died. Had nothing but grit and determination, built a life anyway." Eleanor felt something unclench in her chest. Here was a woman who understood, who'd faced the same uncertainty and survived it, who'd built something from nothing and knew what that cost. "The teaching position," Eleanor said. "Is it real? Or was Caleb being kind?" "Oh, it's real as rain. School burned down last February, and we've been making do with mothers taking turns teaching their own children. But what we need is a proper schoolhouse and a proper teacher. You've got credentials? 5 years teaching in St. Louis, Girls Academy, and then public school." Martha's eyes lit up. "That's better than we hoped for. The committee meets Saturday. Caleb says he'll bring you to town Friday. let you settle in at the boarding house, meet some folks. You impress them on Saturday, and the position is yours. What does it pay? $30 a month, plus room and board at the boarding house. School year runs September through May, but we could use help over the summer too if you're willing. There's reading programs for the adults, Sunday school, that sort of thing. Eleanor did the mathematics quickly. $30 a month was more than she'd made in St. Louis, and with room and board included, she could save most of it. In 6 months, she'd have enough for a train ticket to anywhere she wanted. In a year, enough to truly start over. I'll take it, she said. If the committee approves me, I'll take it. They'll approve you. Martha's certainty was absolute. We're desperate for good teachers, and anyone Caleb Monroe vouches for is worth listening to. Man's got better judgment than most. After Martha left, Eleanor tried on one of the dresses. It fit reasonably well, just a little loose in the waist, and the dark blue fabric was sturdy and practical. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand and barely recognized the woman staring back, thinner than she'd been in St. Louis, harder somehow, but with eyes that held something new. Determination, maybe. Or hope. That evening, she made a proper supper. Venison Caleb had brought in, potatoes roasted with herbs from the garden, bread with butter. It was the best meal she'd cooked since arriving, and she watched with satisfaction as Caleb ate with genuine appetite. Mrs. Garrett speaks highly of you, Eleanor said. Martha's good people. Helped me and Sarah get established when we first came out here. Loaned us supplies we couldn't afford, never asked for repayment. So you're doing for me what she did for you. Caleb shrugged. Territory works that way. People help because someday they'll need help too. It's how we all survive. Eleanor thought about St. Louis, about the boarding houses where everyone kept to themselves, about the careful accounting of favors owed and debts repaid. This was different, a web of mutual obligation that bound people together rather than dividing them. I want to be part of that, she said, the helping. Once I'm established, once I have something to give. You will be. Teacher's an important position in a place like Silver Creek. You'll be helping every family with children, and that's no small thing. Later, after Thomas was asleep and Caleb had gone out to check the horses, Eleanor sat alone in the quiet house and let herself think about James for the first time in days. Where was he now? What lies was he telling? Had he ever intended to stay married to her, or had the whole thing been a con from the start? Marry a woman with a small inheritance, drain her resources, disappear into the Western territories where no one would ask questions. The betrayal still stung, but beneath it she felt something else emerging. Not quite gratitude, she couldn't be grateful for what he'd done, but a strange sort of relief that he'd shown his true nature before they'd reached Oregon, before she'd sunk more years into a marriage built on deception. If James had stayed, she'd be in Oregon now, probably pregnant again, trapped in a life where every day confirmed what her instincts had been whispering for months. She'd have lived that life until it killed her, simply because leaving seemed impossible. But he'd left her first, and in doing so, had set her free. Eleanor understood now what Caleb had meant when he said he wanted her to be free. It wasn't about not owing anyone anything. That was impossible when you lived in community. It was about owing things you'd freely chosen to owe, helping because you wanted to help, building connections based on mutual respect rather than desperate need. She could have that life. The teaching position was real, the settlement needed her, and for the first time since her father died, Eleanor had the chance to build something that belonged entirely to her. All she had to do was be brave enough to reach for it. Friday morning arrived with crystalline clarity, the kind of spring day that made Montana look like a promise instead of a threat. Eleanor dressed in one of Martha's dresses, pinned her hair with extra care, and tried to calm the nervousness fluttering in her chest. Today she would meet the people of Silver Creek, the settlement committee, the community that might become her future. Caleb had the wagon ready by the time she emerged with Thomas bundled against the morning chill. He'd cleaned it, she noticed, and laid fresh blankets across the seat. Small considerations that spoke louder than words. The ride to Silver Creek took just over 2 hours, following a rutted track that wound through grassland beginning to green with spring growth. Caleb drove with easy competence while Eleanor held Thomas and watched the landscape unfold. She'd expected wilderness, isolation, but instead saw signs of human presence everywhere. Fence lines in the distance, smoke from homestead chimneys, cattle grazing on hillsides. The territory was settled, claimed, shaped by people determined to make it yield a living. "It's more civilized than I expected," she said. "Civilization's a relative term out here. We've got laws and churches and schools, but we're still 3 days from the nearest telegraph and a week from anything resembling a city." Caleb guided the wagon around a deep rut. "Silver Creek's grown since I first came. Back then it was 6 buildings and big dreams. Now it's maybe 40 families, a main street, actual prospects. What changed? Silver mine hit a decent vein about 8 years ago. Wasn't enough to make anyone rich, but enough to keep people working steady. That brought merchants, which brought families, which brought the need for all the things families need. School, church, proper doctor. The usual progression. Silver Creek appeared gradually, resolving from distant shapes into actual buildings as they crested a low rise. The settlement sprawled along a creek bed, its main street a wide dirt avenue lined with false-fronted structures that tried for dignity despite their rough construction. Eleanor counted a general store, what looked like a saloon, a church with a modest steeple, several buildings whose purposes weren't immediately clear, and scattered houses ranging from tidy cabins to ambitious 2-story constructions still showing fresh lumber. Caleb drove straight to the general store, where Martha Garrett stood on the porch as if she'd been expecting them at exactly this moment. "Right on time," Martha said, descending to help Eleanor from the wagon. "The boarding house is ready, and I've arranged for the committee to meet you this afternoon instead of tomorrow. Figured you'd rather get it over with than spend the night worrying." Eleanor's stomach clenched, but she nodded. "That's thoughtful. Thank you. The boarding house is just there." Martha pointed to a 2-story building at the end of the street, painted white, with green shutters that gave it an air of respectability. "Mrs. Chen runs it. She's Chinese, been here longer than most of us, and she doesn't tolerate nonsense. You'll like her." They walked down the street with Thomas in Eleanor's arms, and she felt eyes tracking their progress from windows and doorways. Strangers in Silver Creek were notable enough to draw attention, and a strange woman with a baby even more so. Eleanor kept her chin up and her expression pleasant, aware she was being evaluated with every step. The boarding house smelled of lemon oil and bread. Mrs. Chen appeared from the kitchen, a compact woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back severely, and eyes that assessed Eleanor with the same thorough attention Martha had shown. "You are the teacher," she said, not a question. "I hope to be." "Eleanor Whitford." "Sarah Chen, the room is ready. No men, no drinking, no fighting. You pay on time or you leave. Understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Come." Mrs. Chen led them upstairs to a modest room overlooking the street. It held a narrow bed, a washstand, a small table with 2 chairs, and a cradle that looked freshly made. "For the baby," Mrs. Chen said, noting Eleanor's surprise. "All children need a proper place to sleep." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "Thank you. That's very kind." "Not kind. Practical. Baby who sleeps well means mother who sleeps well, which means less crying through the walls." But Mrs. Chen's stern expression softened slightly as she looked at Thomas. "He is healthy?" "Very healthy." "Then he will do fine here." She moved to the door. "Committee meets at 3 o'clock in the church. Martha will come for you. Don't be late. After Mrs. Chen left, Eleanor sat on the bed with Thomas and tried to breathe through her nervousness. Everything was happening so fast. Just over a week ago, she'd been a married woman heading to Oregon, and now she was preparing to interview for a teaching position in a Montana settlement, her husband gone, and her entire future balanced on the next few hours. Caleb appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. "How's the room?" "Perfect. More than I expected." Eleanor looked up at him. "Will you be at the meeting this afternoon?" "If you want me there." "I do. I know I need to stand on my own, but—" She trailed off, unsure how to articulate the comfort his presence provided. "I'll be there," Caleb said simply. "Martha, too. You won't be walking into that room alone." At precisely 3 o'clock, Eleanor entered the church to find 7 people waiting, 3 men and 4 women, ranging in age from perhaps 30 to 60, all dressed in their best clothes and wearing expressions of careful neutrality. Martha made introductions swiftly. "This is Eleanor Whitford, recently of St. Louis, where she taught for 5 years. Eleanor, This is the settlement committee. Robert Hayes, our minister. Dr. Sam, and the ladies are myself, obviously, Catherine Morrison, Elizabeth Hayes, and Margaret Thornton. Eleanor nodded to each in turn, trying to remember names and faces while fighting the urge to fidget with Thomas, who sat quietly in her arms observing the strangers with his usual solemn intensity. Robert Hayes spoke first, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who gave sermons regularly. Mrs. Whitford, we appreciate you making the journey to Silver Creek. Martha has spoken highly of your qualifications, and Mr. Monroe's recommendation carries considerable weight. However, we do have some questions before we can make a decision. Of course, I'm happy to answer anything. Your teaching experience in St. Louis, what grades did you work with? I started at a girls' academy teaching reading and composition to students aged 12 to 16. Later, I moved to public school where I taught mixed grades, primarily 7 through 12. I'm comfortable with younger students as well, though my formal experience is with older children. Catherine Morrison leaned forward, her expression kind but curious. What made you leave St. Louis? Eleanor had prepared for this question, had rehearsed various versions of the truth that might sound less damning, but sitting in the church with these people who would be her neighbors if she stayed, she found she couldn't begin with a lie. I married a man I thought was trustworthy. He convinced me to come west with him to start a new life in Oregon. On the journey, when our wagon broke down, he left me and our son behind, taking all our money with him. I don't know where he is now, and frankly, I don't care to find out. The silence that followed was heavy. Eleanor saw the committee members exchanging glances, saw judgment forming in some eyes and sympathy in others. She waited, holding Thomas close, preparing for rejection. Margaret Thornton spoke unexpectedly, her voice firm despite her age. So you're alone now, supporting yourself and a child? Yes, ma'am. That's why I need this position. I won't pretend otherwise. And if your husband returns? If he comes looking for you? Eleanor met the older woman's eyes steadily. Then he'll find I'm no longer interested in being his wife. I may be legally married, but I consider myself bound to a man who abandoned us to die in a storm. If I need to seek a divorce, I will. Dr. Blake cleared his throat. Divorce is a serious matter, Mrs. Whitford. Scandalous in some circles. Less scandalous than abandonment, I'd think. But I understand your concern. I won't bring drama to this settlement. I want to work, to teach your children well, and to build a quiet, respectable life, that's all. And the baby? Elizabeth Hayes asked, not unkindly. Teaching is demanding work. How will you manage with an infant? Before Eleanor could answer, Martha cut in. Sarah Chen has already agreed to mind the child during school hours. She raised 4 of her own while running the boarding house. And before anyone asks, yes, she'll charge a fair rate. And yes, Mrs. Whitford can afford it on the salary we're offering. If we offer the position, John Morrison said carefully, which we haven't decided yet. John, don't be dense. Margaret Thornton's voice carried the authority of someone who'd lived through enough nonsense to recognize more when she saw it. We've had children going without proper education for nearly 4 months. Mrs. Whitford is qualified, willing, and available. The only question is whether we're going to let our prejudices about abandoned wives get in the way of doing what's right for our children. It's not prejudice, Robert Hayes protested. It's concern about propriety. A woman alone, potentially still married, teaching our daughters, would be teaching them that intelligence and capability matter more than a man's approval, Margaret interrupted. Seems like a good lesson to me. The debate continued, polite but pointed, while Eleanor sat and tried not to let her desperation show. She focused on Thomas, on keeping her breathing steady, on maintaining the composure that might convince them she was stable enough for the responsibility they were considering. Finally, Caleb spoke from his position near the back of the room. He'd been so quiet, Eleanor had almost forgotten he was there. I've known Mrs. Whitford for just over a week, he said, his voice cutting through the discussion. In that time, I've watched her handle disaster with more grace than most men show in comfort. She's smart, practical, doesn't complain, and works harder than she needs to just to earn her keep. If you're worried about her character, don't be. If you're worried about scandal, I'll vouch for her myself, and anyone who wants to gossip about a woman who's already been through hell can take it up with me directly. The room fell silent. Eleanor felt heat creep up her neck, touched and embarrassed in equal measure by Caleb's fierce defense. Dr. Blake spoke carefully. "That's quite an endorsement, Caleb. You're certain?" "I'm certain she deserves a chance. What she does with it is up to her, but she deserves the opportunity to try." More glances exchanged, more silent communication Eleanor couldn't quite read. Then Margaret Thornton stood, her decision clearly made. "I move we offer Mrs. Whitford the teaching position, starting immediately at $30 per month plus room and board. Summer work to be negotiated separately. All in favor?" 4 hands went up immediately, Margaret's, Martha's, Catherine Morrison's, and Dr. Blake's. After a moment's hesitation, Elizabeth Hayes raised her hand as well. Robert Hayes and John Morrison sat with hands folded, their expressions disapproving but outnumbered. "Motion carries," Margaret said with satisfaction. "Welcome to Silver Creek, Mrs. Whitford. We'll have contracts drawn up by Monday, and you can start working on the school building plans immediately. We've got lumber donated and waiting, but we need someone to tell us what a proper schoolhouse actually needs." Eleanor felt something break loose in her chest. Relief, gratitude, hope, all tangled together. "Thank you, all of you. I won't let you down." "See that you don't," John Morrison said stiffly. "We're taking a considerable risk on you." "And she's taking a considerable risk on us," Martha shot back. "Moving to a settlement she's never seen, trusting strangers to honor their commitments. Goes both ways, John." After the meeting dispersed, Eleanor stood outside the church with Thomas, still processing what had just happened. She had a job, a real job, with a salary and purpose and the foundation for building something permanent. Caleb approached quietly, hat in hand. "Congratulations." "Thank you, and thank you for what you said in there. You didn't have to defend me so fiercely." "Yes, I did. They were about to let good sense get overruled by propriety, and that's how settlements end up with no teachers and children who can't read." He settled his hat back on his head. "You earned this, Eleanor. Remember that when people like Morrison make you feel like it was charity." "Will you stay in town tonight? Martha mentioned there's a dance at the saloon. Sort of a welcome for me." "Rather get back to the ranch. Animals need tending, and I'm not much for dancing anyway." He glanced toward the boarding house. "But you'll be fine here. Martha will look after you, and Mrs. Chen doesn't let trouble past her front door." Eleanor felt an unexpected pang at the thought of him leaving. Over the past week, Caleb's steady presence had become something she relied on, not in the desperate way she'd relied on James, but in the quieter way you relied on solid ground beneath your feet. "When will I see you again?" "I'll bring supplies to town in a few weeks. Check in, see how you're settling." He paused, something unreadable crossing his face. "But you don't need me checking in, Eleanor. You're going to do just fine on your own." He was right, she knew. This was exactly what she'd wanted. Independence, the ability to stand without anyone's support. But knowing it and feeling it were different things, and she found herself wishing he'd stay just a little longer. "Safe travels," she said instead, "and thank you for everything." Caleb nodded once, then walked to his wagon and drove away without looking back. Eleanor watched until he disappeared around a bend, then carried Thomas inside to begin her new life. The dance that evening was held in the saloon, which had been temporarily cleared of its rougher clientele for the occasion. Eleanor wore her better dress and tried not to feel self-conscious as Martha introduced her to what felt like every person in Silver Creek. Names and faces blurred together, homesteaders and miners, merchants and their wives, children who would be her students, all curious about the new teacher who'd arrived with such dramatic circumstances. She danced twice, both times with older gentlemen who treated her with grandfatherly courtesy, and spent the rest of the evening holding Thomas and making conversation with the settlement's women. They were cautiously welcoming, asking about her plans for the school, sharing stories of their own children's educational needs, offering advice about surviving Montana winters. "You'll want to stock up on lamp oil," Catherine Morrison said. "Winter nights are long, and you'll be grading papers by lamplight from October through March." "And wool stockings," added another woman whose name Eleanor had already forgotten. "The boarding house gets drafty when the temperature drops below zero." "Below zero?" Eleanor tried not to sound alarmed. "Regularly, sometimes stays that way for weeks." The woman's smile was sympathetic. "But you'll adjust. Everyone does, or they leave. No middle ground in this territory." Around 10 o'clock, a commotion at the door drew everyone's attention. A man entered, travel-worn and dusty, his eyes scanning the crowd with obvious purpose. When his gaze landed on Eleanor, he started toward her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Martha stepped smoothly into his path. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Eleanor Whitford. Heard she was in town." Eleanor's stomach dropped. The voice was unfamiliar, but the way he was looking at her sent warning bells ringing. She shifted Thomas to her other hip and waited. "Who's asking?" Martha's tone had gone cool. "Name's Daniel Whitford. I'm looking for my brother's wife." The saloon went quiet. Eleanor felt every eye turn toward her, felt the weight of judgment and curiosity pressing down like a physical force. "Your brother," she said carefully, "abandoned me and my son during a storm, took all our money and left us to die. I'm not sure what you think I owe him, but you're mistaken." Daniel Whitford stepped around Martha, though she kept herself between him and Eleanor with clear intent. He was younger than James, perhaps 25, with similar features but harder eyes. "James is dead," he said flatly. "Got thrown from his horse 3 days after he left you. Broke his neck. I've been tracking his movements, trying to settle his affairs." The words should have hit harder, should have carried grief or shock or something more than the strange numbness that settled over Eleanor's shoulders. James was dead. The man she'd married, the father of her child, was simply gone from the world. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, and meant it, though not in the way Daniel probably expected. "Are you?" His voice carried an edge. "Because from what I've heard, you landed on your feet pretty quick, living with some rancher, now taking a job here. Doesn't seem like you're mourning much." Eleanor felt anger flare, hot and clean. "Your brother left me stranded with a 6-month-old baby in a wagon with a broken wheel during a storm that could have killed us both. He took every cent we had and rode away without looking back. If Mr. Monroe hadn't found us, Thomas and I would be dead too. So no, I'm not mourning. I'm surviving, which is more than James gave me the opportunity to do. James wasn't perfect, but he was family, and that baby is his son, which makes him my family too." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor pulled Thomas closer, protective instinct overriding everything else. "Thomas is my son. Your brother's name might be on some piece of paper somewhere, but James never acted like a father, never earned the right to that title. Still blood, though, still a Whitford." Daniel's expression hardened. "I've got rights, legal rights, and I'm not sure a woman alone is fit to raise a Whitford child properly." Dr. Blake stepped forward, his voice carrying professional authority. "Mr. Whitford, if you're suggesting what I think you're suggesting, you should know that this settlement takes care of its own. Mrs. Whitford is now a member of this community, and any legal challenges you want to bring will be met with considerable resistance." "I'm not challenging anything, just making sure my nephew is being raised right." "He's being raised by his mother who loves him and provides for him," Martha said sharply. "If that's not right enough for you, then I suggest you leave before you say something you'll regret." Daniel looked around the room, clearly calculating his odds against the united front forming against him. Whatever he saw must have convinced him to retreat because his posture relaxed slightly. "I'm not here to make trouble, just wanted to see the boy, make sure he's healthy, family concern." "He's healthy," Eleanor said. "As you can see. Now, if you'll excuse me, it's past his bedtime." She walked toward the door with as much dignity as she could muster, aware of Daniel's eyes tracking her movement. Martha and Dr. Blake flanked her like guards, making it clear that any attempt to follow would be met with immediate resistance. Back at the boarding house, Eleanor sat in her room with Thomas and tried to process what had just happened. James was dead. She was a widow. And apparently his family knew enough about what he'd done to come looking for answers. A knock at her door made her jump. "It's Martha. Can I come in?" Eleanor opened the door to find Martha carrying a tea tray, her expression grim. "That was unfortunate," Martha said, setting the tray on the small table, "but not unexpected. Men like James usually have families who make excuses for them." "Do you think he'll cause trouble? Try to take Thomas?" "He can try. Won't get far. Montana's big on mother's rights when it comes to children, and you've got a whole settlement willing to testify that you're a fit parent. Plus, Daniel would have to prove he could provide better care, and a single man working mines isn't exactly the picture of stability. Eleanor wrapped her hands around the warm teacup, grateful for something to hold. James is really dead. Sounds like it. Does that change anything for you? I don't know. I thought I'd feel something more significant. But mostly I just feel relief that he can't come back and complicate things. She paused. Does that make me heartless? Makes you honest. Martha sipped her own tea. Eleanor, you're allowed to be relieved that a man who betrayed you can't hurt you anymore. That's not heartless. That's survival. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking tea while Thomas slept in his new cradle. Finally, Martha stood to leave. Get some rest. Tomorrow we'll start planning the school, and you can begin meeting your students. Life goes on, even after the dramatic parts. After Martha left, Eleanor changed into her nightgown and lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. James was dead. She was a widow. Thomas was fatherless, though he'd essentially been fatherless from birth. She waited for grief to come, for some evidence that she'd loved the man she'd married. But all she felt was a bone-deep weariness and a cautious, growing certainty that his death had freed her in ways his life never could have. She was 24 years old, a widow with a baby, starting over in a Montana settlement with nothing but her teaching skills and the clothes Martha's daughter had left behind. By every reasonable measure, her life was a disaster. But lying there in the darkness, listening to Thomas breathe peacefully in his cradle, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in months. She felt like herself again. Not someone's wife, not someone's disappointment, not someone's burden. Just Eleanor, capable and flawed, and building something that belonged entirely to her. It was terrifying. It was liberating. It was enough. The next morning brought new complications in the form of Daniel Whitford waiting outside the boarding house. Eleanor saw him from her window and considered not going down, but hiding felt like cowardice, and she'd had enough of being afraid. She descended with Thomas in her arms and met Daniel on the street, keeping Mrs. Chen's porch between them like a barrier. I owe you an apology, Daniel said without preamble. Last night I was angry and tired, and I took it out on you. That wasn't fair. Eleanor studied him warily. What changed overnight? I talked to some folks, heard the full story of what James did, not just his version from the letters he sent before he died. Daniel's jaw tightened. My brother was a lot of things, and apparently honest wasn't one of them. I'm sorry for what he put you through. Did you know, Eleanor asked, that he was lying to me? That he'd done this before? Daniel hesitated, and in that hesitation she had her answer. I knew he had a talent for finding women with resources and convincing them to invest in his dreams. I didn't know he'd actually married you. Thought he'd learned his lesson after... He trailed off. After what? There was another woman in Kansas City. He took her money and left her too, but she wasn't pregnant, wasn't stranded, just cheated and angry. I helped pay her back, told James he needed to stop. Thought he had. Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. So I wasn't the first. No. And there was someone else too, I found out after I started looking into his affairs. A woman named Margaret Doyle, also pregnant, also promised marriage. He left her in Denver 3 months before he met you. The name Margaret Doyle meant nothing to Eleanor, but the implication made her head spin. Multiple women, multiple lies. James hadn't just been a bad husband, he'd been a predator, systematically targeting vulnerable women and leaving destruction in his wake. Where is she now, this Margaret Doyle? I don't know. Lost track of her after Denver. But I thought you should know you weren't alone in this, that it wasn't something wrong with you that made him leave. Eleanor looked down at Thomas, at his small face so innocent of his father's sins. What happens now, with his estate, his debts? He didn't have much. The horse was stolen. The money he took from you was mostly gone except for about $30 I found in his saddlebag. I can give you that if you want it. Seems like it's rightfully yours anyway. Keep it. Use it to pay back the woman in Kansas City, or find Margaret Doyle and help her too. I don't want anything that came from James. Daniel nodded slowly. You're stronger than he deserved. I hope you know that. I'm learning it, Eleanor said, but I appreciate you saying so. After Daniel left, Eleanor carried Thomas to the site where the school would be built. Margaret Thornton was already there, examining the lumber pile with a critical eye. Good, you're here. I wanted your thoughts on the design. We've got enough lumber for something basic, but if we're clever about it, we could build something that'll last 30 years instead of 10. They spent the morning planning, sketching rough designs in the dirt, debating window placement and door width, and where to put the wood stove. Other committee members drifted by throughout the day, offering opinions and labor, and by afternoon, Eleanor had a clear vision of what her schoolhouse would look like. It would be simple but solid, with large windows for light, a good stove for heat, proper desks built from the remaining lumber. There would be a small library corner, a slate board along one wall, space for maps and charts. Nothing fancy, but everything necessary. We'll start building next week, Margaret said. Meanwhile, you can begin teaching in the church. Reverend Hayes agreed to let you use the space weekday mornings. It'll be cramped, but it's better than nothing. That afternoon, Eleanor met her students for the first time. 17 children ranging from age 6 to 15 filed into the church with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some looked eager, others suspicious, a few openly defiant. Eleanor recognized the pattern from her St. Louis days. Frontier children had different priorities than city children, and convincing them that reading mattered more than ranch work would be her first real challenge. She started with introductions, learning names and rough skill levels, assessing who could read fluently and who was still learning letters. Then she told them a story, one of her favorites from childhood, watching their faces light up with attention despite their earlier skepticism. "That's what books are," she said when she'd finished. "Stories that take you places you've never been, teach you things you'd never learn otherwise. Some of you will stay in Silver Creek your whole lives, and that's fine. It's a good place. But books can show you the rest of the world anyway. And some of you will leave someday, go to places where reading and writing well will make the difference between opportunity and being cheated. Either way, what we learn together matters." A boy in the back, maybe 13, raised his hand. "My pa says reading's for folks with time to waste. Says we got work to do." Your pa's right that there's always work. But reading doesn't take away from work. It makes you better at it. You want to own land someday? You'll need to read contracts, survey maps, legal documents. Want to know if the price the merchant's charging is fair? Better know your numbers. Want to write letters to family back east, or keep records of your cattle, or run a business? All of that starts with what we do in this room. She saw understanding flicker in some eyes, resistance in others. It would take time, patience, proof that what she offered had value. But Eleanor had time now. Had patience born from surviving worse than skeptical students. Had the proof of her own life that education mattered. By the end of that first day, she was exhausted but satisfied. This was work she knew how to do, work that felt purposeful and real. And when she returned to the boarding house with Thomas, Mrs. Chen had hot soup waiting and the first genuine smile Eleanor had seen on her stern face. "The children say you tell good stories. This is important. Teacher who makes learning interesting is teacher who keeps students coming back." "Thank you. I hope I can live up to their expectations." You will or you won't. Either way, you try. That matters too. That night, Eleanor wrote her first letter on the small desk in her room, addressed to no one in particular but needed anyway. She wrote about the past 2 weeks, about storms and strangers, and the peculiar mercy of being abandoned by someone who never deserved her in the first place. She wrote about Caleb's quiet kindness, about Martha's fierce defense, about the children's faces when she told them stories. She wrote until her hand cramped and the lamp oil ran low, and when she finally set down her pen, she felt lighter somehow, as if putting words to paper had helped her understand what she'd lived through, had given shape to the chaos and meaning to the survival. James was dead. That part of her life was finished, sealed, done. But Eleanor Whitford was very much alive, and her story was just beginning. 3 weeks passed before Eleanor saw Caleb again. She'd settled into a rhythm by then, mornings teaching in the church, afternoons planning lessons while Mrs. Chen minded Thomas, evenings grading papers by lamplight. The work was demanding but satisfying, and the children were beginning to trust her enough to actually try learning instead of just enduring her presence. She was walking back from the church on a Tuesday afternoon, Thomas bundled against the spring wind, when she saw the familiar bay horse tied outside the general store. Her heart did something complicated in her chest, a reaction she didn't want to examine too closely. Caleb emerged from the store carrying supplies, and when he saw her, his expression shifted into something that might have been pleasure, quickly schooled back to neutral. "Mrs. Whitford, heard you're doing well with the students." "Mr. Monroe, yes, they're good children, eager to learn once they trust you mean what you say." She shifted Thomas to her other hip. "How's the ranch?" "Surviving spring, lost a few calves to a late cold snap, but that's the way of things." He secured his supplies to the saddle, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. "You look settled, different than you did 3 weeks ago." Eleanor knew what he meant. She felt different, steadier, more solid, like someone who'd found their footing after a long fall. The constant anxiety that had characterized her marriage to James had faded, replaced by the simpler worries of lesson planning and student progress. "I'm settled, thanks to you giving me the chance to be." "You gave yourself the chance? I just didn't get in the way." He paused, and something unspoken passed between them. "There's a barn raising on Saturday at the Henderson place. Whole settlement's invited. You should come." "I don't know if I'd be welcome. I'm still fairly new, and some folks—" She trailed off, thinking of John Morrison's continued coolness, of the whispers she sometimes heard when she walked past certain groups. "You're welcome," Caleb said firmly, "and anyone who suggests otherwise can take it up with me." The barn raising was exactly what Eleanor needed, though she hadn't known it until she arrived. The entire settlement had turned out, bringing food and tools and children who ran wild between the adults' legs. The Hendersons' oldest boy, the one who'd been coughing that night on the wagon train, was healthy again, chasing his siblings with the boundless energy of recovery. Mrs. Henderson caught Eleanor's eye across the work site and came over, wiping flour from her hands. "I heard what you did," she said quietly, "turning down the wagon train to stay here and teach. That took courage." "I didn't have much choice. Your wagon was already full, and I had no money to pay passage. We would have made room, would have found a way." Mrs. Henderson's eyes were serious. "But you chose to stay anyway, to build something instead of just surviving. That matters." The women worked on preparing food while the men framed the barn, and Eleanor found herself drawn into conversations she'd been too nervous to initiate before. She learned that Catherine Morrison had been a teacher herself before marrying, that Margaret Thornton had buried 3 husbands and outlived them all with grim satisfaction, that half the settlement's women had come west under circumstances as desperate as Eleanor's own. "We're all running from something or toward something," Martha said, kneading bread dough with vigorous efficiency. "The smart ones figure out which it is before they get too far down the wrong road." "And which am I?" Eleanor asked. "Running from or toward?" "Both, I'd say. Running from a bad marriage toward something better. Nothing wrong with that." By late afternoon, the barn's frame stood tall against the sky, and the men had moved to raising the roof beams. Eleanor was helping set out food when she heard raised voices from the work site. "I'm telling you it's not secure enough," someone was saying. John Morrison, by the sound of it. "We need another support beam here or the whole thing could come down in the first heavy snow." "And I'm telling you, we don't have enough lumber for another beam without compromising the south wall," another man argued. Eleanor watched Caleb move to examine the structure, running his hands along the joints, testing the stability with methodical care. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who'd built enough structures to know what would hold and what wouldn't. "Morrison's right. This won't hold a Montana winter without more support. But we can salvage lumber from the old Henderson chicken coop. It's half collapsed anyway, and they were planning to tear it down. Use those beams here. Rebuild the coop smaller with what's left." The solution was so practical, so obvious once stated, that the argument dissolved immediately. Men dispersed to implement the plan, and Eleanor saw the respect in their movements, the way they deferred to Caleb's judgment without question. "He's like that," Martha said, appearing at Eleanor's elbow. "Solves problems instead of creating them. Rare quality in a man." "You seem to be suggesting something?" "Just observing. You could do worse than Caleb Monroe." Eleanor felt heat creep up her neck. "I'm barely a widow. It's been less than a month since James died." "James died the moment he rode away from you in that storm. You were a widow long before his body caught up with the fact." Martha's voice was pragmatic, not unkind. "I'm not saying rush into anything, but when enough time has passed, when you're ready to think about such things again, you could do a lot worse." I don't think I want to think about such things at all. I like being independent, making my own decisions. Means having someone who respects it, supports it, makes your life better instead of smaller. Martha returned to her bread dough. But like I said, just observing. That evening, as the work wound down and people gathered for the meal, Eleanor found herself seated near Caleb at one of the long tables. They ate in comfortable silence while around them conversations swirled about weather and crops and the latest news from Fort Benton. "Daniel Whitford came to see me," Eleanor said quietly, not sure why she was sharing this except that Caleb seemed like someone who deserved to know. James's brother. He told me James had done this before. Multiple women, all pregnant or newly married, all left with nothing. Caleb's jaw tightened. Did he cause trouble? No, actually apologized, which surprised me. Said he'd tried to stop James after the first time but thought he'd succeeded. She pushed food around her plate. There was another woman, Margaret Doyle. He promised to marry her too, left her pregnant in Denver. Daniel doesn't know where she is now. You thinking about looking for her? The question surprised Eleanor. She hadn't been, but now that Caleb mentioned it, the idea settled into her mind with unexpected weight. Should I? Would it help her to know she's not alone in this? Might. Might also dredge up pain she's already dealt with. Hard to say. Caleb took a drink of water. But if you decide you want to try finding her, I know some people in Denver. Could ask around. Why would you do that? Because you're the kind of person who worries about a stranger you've never met, which means you're the kind of person worth helping. He met her eyes steadily. And because knowing you're not alone in something makes it easier to carry. 2 days later, a letter arrived at the boarding house addressed to Eleanor Whitford in unfamiliar handwriting. Mrs. Chen brought it up with the morning coffee, her expression curious but discreet. Eleanor opened it with trembling hands, not sure what to expect. The letter was from a woman named Margaret Doyle, writing from a mining camp outside Denver. Daniel Whitford had found her and told her about Eleanor, and Margaret had decided to reach out. I thought I was the only fool he'd conned, the letter read in neat, careful script. Knowing there's another woman who survived him makes me feel less ashamed somehow. I wanted you to know you're not alone either, and I wanted to tell you what I learned after he left me, that men like James Whitford count on women keeping silent about their shame. They count on us being too embarrassed to warn each other. But I'm not embarrassed anymore. I'm angry. And if my story can help you feel less alone, then some good came from the whole mess. The letter went on to describe Margaret's experience, eerily similar to Eleanor's own. The whirlwind courtship, the promises of a better life, the pregnancy that seemed to seal their future together. Then the abandonment, the discovery that he'd taken her savings, the long struggle to rebuild. I work as a seamstress now, Margaret wrote. It's hard work, and the pay isn't generous, but it's mine. I'm raising my daughter. Her name is Ruth. She's 9 months old, and we're doing fine. Better than fine, actually. Better than we would have done with a liar and a thief for a husband and father. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, feeling something unlock in her chest. Margaret's anger was clean and righteous, unmarred by the shame Eleanor had been carrying like a secret burden. Here was proof that James's betrayal said everything about him and nothing about the women he'd fooled. She wrote back that same evening, pouring out the whole story, the storm, Caleb's rescue, the teaching position, her hopes for the future. She wrote about Thomas and asked about Ruth, about what it was like raising a daughter alone in a mining camp, about whether Margaret had found community there the way Eleanor had in Silver Creek. I think we survived something together, even though we never met, Eleanor wrote. And I think we're both stronger for it, though I wish we'd never had to be. She posted the letter the next morning and tried not to think about how good it felt to have someone who understood, who'd walked the same path and come out whole on the other side. Spring deepened into early summer, and the schoolhouse began to take shape. Eleanor spent her afternoons at the construction site when she could, watching the building rise from foundation to frame to something that was starting to resemble the vision she'd sketched in the dirt weeks ago. The children had started calling her Miss Eleanor instead of Mrs. Whitford, a shift that felt significant even though she hadn't requested it. It marked her as theirs somehow, as belonging to the settlement rather than to a marriage that had never really existed. One afternoon, as she was reviewing arithmetic with the older students, the church door opened and a woman Eleanor didn't recognize slipped inside. She was younger than Eleanor, maybe 20, visibly pregnant, and carrying herself with the careful exhaustion of someone who'd traveled hard and far. Eleanor finished the lesson and dismissed the children, then approached the stranger with a smile she hoped was welcoming. "Can I help you?" The woman's eyes were red-rimmed, her dress travel-stained. "Are you Eleanor Whitford, the teacher?" "I am." "My name is Sarah Bennett. I'm looking for my husband. He left me in Fort Benton 2 weeks ago, said he was going to scout ahead and find us a place to settle. Took our wagon, our money, everything. Someone at the fort said women who get abandoned sometimes end up here, that there's a teacher who helps them." Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. This woman's story was hers, was Margaret's, was probably a dozen others across the territory. How many women had James Whitford destroyed? How many were still out there waiting for men who would never return? "Your husband's name?" Eleanor asked, though she already suspected the answer. "James Bennett, though I'm starting to think that might not be his real name." Eleanor guided Sarah to a pew and sat beside her, taking her hand. "I'm so sorry, but you need to know something. The man you married, whether he called himself Bennett or Whitford or something else, is dead. He died about 6 weeks ago, thrown from a horse. And he wasn't who he said he was." Sarah's face crumpled. "I knew, deep down I knew he wasn't coming back, but I hoped—" "I know, I hoped too. We all did." Eleanor squeezed her hand. "How far along are you?" 6 months, due in September." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know what to do. I don't have family, don't have money. I thought if I could find James, or if I could find work, or something." Eleanor looked at this woman, this girl, really, barely more than a child herself, and felt the weight of recognition. She was looking at herself 6 weeks ago, stranded and desperate and running out of choices. "You're going to stay here," Eleanor said firmly. "We'll find you work, a place to live. The settlement takes care of its own, and you're one of ours now whether you plan to be or not." "I can't ask." "You're not asking. I'm telling you. You survived him, and that matters. Now we help you do more than survive." That evening, Eleanor brought Sarah to Martha's store, where a council of war quickly formed around the scared young woman. Martha, Margaret Thornton, Catherine Morrison, and Dr. Blake's wife assembled with the practiced efficiency of people who'd solved similar problems before. "She can stay with me until the baby comes," Mrs. Blake offered. "We've got the room, and I'll feel better having a pregnant woman under my roof where I can keep an eye on her." "The Hendersons need help with their children," Catherine said. "Sarah could work there for room and board, save up money before the baby arrives." "And after?" Sarah asked tremulously. "After the baby comes, what then?" "Then you keep working, and we help with the child same as we help with any child in this settlement," Martha said briskly. "You're not the first woman to end up here alone and pregnant, and you won't be the last. We know how to manage." Eleanor watched the women organize Sarah's future with the same practical kindness they'd shown her, and felt something shift in her understanding of what community meant. This wasn't charity. It was reciprocity, an understanding that any of them could need help at any moment, and that strength came from being willing to both give and receive it. Later, walking back to the boarding house with Thomas, Eleanor met Caleb on the street. He was leaving the blacksmith shop, a new tool in his hand, and when he saw her, his expression lightened. "Heard you took in another stray today. News travels fast, always does in small settlements." He fell into step beside her. "You're building quite a reputation as someone who helps lost women find their footing." "I'm just doing what people did for me. Seems only fair." They walked in silence for a moment, the evening air soft with the promise of summer. Finally, Caleb spoke, his voice thoughtful. "You know what you're doing here? You're building something bigger than a school. You're building a network, a safety system for women who need it. That matters, Eleanor, more than you probably realize." "I'm just helping where I can. That's what building a community looks like. Helping where you can, when you can, knowing someone will help you when you need it." He stopped walking, turning to face her. "You're good at this. At seeing what needs doing and doing it without making people feel small for needing help." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. You did the same for me. Maybe we're both good at it then. His smile was small but genuine. I'm glad you're here, Eleanor. Glad the storm brought you to Silver Creek instead of sweeping you past to somewhere else. So am I, she said, and realized she meant it completely. A week later, Margaret Doyle's second letter arrived, and with it a proposition that made Eleanor's heart race. I've been thinking about what you said, Margaret wrote, about how James counted on us being ashamed, on us keeping silent. What if we didn't? What if we warned other women, helped them recognize the signs before they got in too deep? I know it sounds ambitious, maybe crazy, but I can't stop thinking about how many women might still be out there, trapped by men like him. The idea took root in Eleanor's mind and grew. What if they did warn others? What if the network of women she was building in Silver Creek connected to Margaret's contacts in Denver, to other women in other settlements who'd survived similar betrayals? She brought the idea to Martha first, testing it on someone whose practical sense she trusted. It's ambitious, Martha said slowly, and it could make you enemies. Men who profit from women's silence won't like you teaching women to speak up. But would it help? Probably, definitely. Women protecting each other, sharing information, refusing to be isolated, that's powerful. Martha's eyes gleamed with something that might have been approval. You'd need to be careful about it. Can't go around accusing men without proof. But teaching women to trust their instincts, to ask questions, to verify claims before they trust, that's just good sense. Eleanor drafted a careful letter to Margaret that evening, proposing they create a system for sharing information, warning signs to watch for, questions to ask, resources available in different settlements. Nothing formal, nothing that would draw unwanted attention, just women helping women the way they'd been helping each other for generations. Margaret's response came faster than expected, filled with enthusiasm and practical suggestions. Within a month, they had a rudimentary network, women in 5 different settlements who agreed to watch for vulnerable women and offer help before desperation made them easy targets. It wasn't much. It wouldn't save everyone. But it was something, and something was better than the silence that had protected men like James for far too long. The schoolhouse was completed in late June, just as summer heat began to settle over the valley. Eleanor stood in the empty building, her building now, in every way that mattered, and felt pride swell in her chest. The windows let in generous light. The stove was positioned perfectly for winter warmth. The desks were rough but sturdy. It was exactly what she'd envisioned, brought to life by community effort and shared purpose. Caleb found her there, standing in the middle of the room with Thomas on her hip, both of them surveying the space with matching expressions of satisfaction. "Looks good," he said from the doorway. "You should be proud." "I am, though I didn't build it myself. You designed it. You told people what was needed and why it mattered. That's its own kind of building." He stepped inside, his boots loud on the new floorboards. "School starts in September?" "Yes. I'll have 23 students this year, up from 17. Parents are starting to believe education matters enough to send their children regularly." "That's your doing too. You proved it had value." Caleb moved to the window, looking out at the settlement beyond. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something." The seriousness in his tone made her nervous. "What is it?" "I've been thinking about selling the ranch, moving closer to town, maybe buying some land on the edge of the settlement where I could run a smaller operation. The isolation was fine when Sarah was alive, when I had someone to share it with. But these last 3 years," he trailed off. "It's too much silence, too much empty space." Eleanor's heart did something complicated. "That seems like a big change." "It is, but I'm ready for it." He turned to face her. "And I wanted you to know before I started making arrangements. Wanted you to know it's not about running away from anything. It's about moving toward something better." She understood what he wasn't saying, that the something better included the possibility of her, of them, of a future that went beyond the practical kindness of strangers helping strangers. The knowledge settled in her chest like a warm stone, simultaneously comforting and terrifying. "I'm not ready," she said carefully. "Not yet. It's too soon after James, too soon after everything." "I know. I'm not asking for anything now, just letting you know my intentions so there's no confusion when I show up in town more often." His smile was gentle. "Take all the time you need, Eleanor. I'm not going anywhere." After he left, Eleanor stood alone in her schoolhouse with Thomas and tried to imagine the future Caleb was offering. A life shared with someone who respected her independence, who saw her strength instead of her weakness, who wanted to move toward her rather than asking her to shrink herself to fit his needs. It was terrifying how much she wanted it. How much the possibility of loving again, of being loved properly this time, made her chest tight with longing and fear in equal measure. But Caleb was right. She had time, had space to heal, to grow, to become fully herself before deciding whether to share that self with someone else. For now, it was enough to stand in her schoolhouse, holding her son, knowing she'd built something that would outlast her pain and serve as proof that survival could transform into something worth celebrating. The storm that had nearly killed her had also set her free, and Eleanor Whitford was finally learning what to do with freedom. Summer turned the Montana Territory into something almost gentle, the harsh edges softened by long days and warm winds that carried the scent of wild grass and sage. Eleanor settled into her life in Silver Creek with the kind of contentment she'd never expected to feel, teaching during the mornings, helping Sarah Bennett prepare for her baby in the afternoons, writing letters to Margaret Doyle in the evenings while Thomas played at her feet. The network of women they'd created was growing quietly, carefully, like roots spreading beneath the surface. A woman in Billings had written asking for advice about a suitor whose promises seemed too good to be true. Another in Helena had shared information about a man working the mining camps with 3 different names and 3 different stories. They weren't stopping all the James Whitfords of the world, but they were making it harder for such men to operate in darkness. Caleb had been true to his word, appearing in town more frequently as summer progressed. He'd purchased 20 acres on the eastern edge of Silver Creek and was building a smaller ranch house there, close enough to town for company, but far enough for the solitude he still needed. Eleanor watched the construction progress whenever she walked past, watched Caleb and his hired men raise walls and frame windows, and felt something in her chest pull tight with possibility. They spoke often but carefully, dancing around the thing growing between them with the caution of people who'd both been burned before. He brought her books from Fort Benton. She sent him home with bread she'd learned to bake in Mrs. Chen's kitchen. They sat together at community meals and walked together after church, always with Thomas between them like a small chaperone, always proper enough that the gossips had nothing concrete to whisper about. But Eleanor saw the way Caleb looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, saw the tenderness in his eyes when he held Thomas, and knew that the careful distance between them was temporary. The question wasn't whether something would happen, but when she'd be ready to let it. August brought Sarah Bennett's labor, fierce and fast, in the middle of a thunderstorm that reminded Eleanor too vividly of the night she'd been abandoned. She sat with Sarah through the long hours, holding her hand while Dr. Blake's wife worked with calm efficiency, and when the baby finally came, a girl with dark hair and furious lungs, Eleanor felt tears stream down her face. "You did it," she whispered to Sarah, who lay exhausted and triumphant against the pillows. "You survived him, and now look what you've built." Sarah named the baby Eleanor, which made Eleanor cry harder, and when Caleb came by the next day to check on mother and child, he found Eleanor holding the infant with an expression of such fierce protectiveness that he had to look away. "You're good at this," he said quietly, "taking care of people, building community." "I'm just doing what needs doing." "That's what I said about finding you in the storm. Seems like we both underestimate ourselves." He settled into the chair across from her, his hat in his hands. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." Her heart started hammering. "All right. I'm in love with you, have been for weeks, probably since that first night when you stood in my kitchen dripping wet and still found the courage to say thank you. I know it's too soon, I know you're not ready, and I'm not asking you to feel the same way or do anything about it. But I wanted you to know, because I'm tired of pretending I'm just a friend who happens to show up wherever you are." Eleanor sat very still, the baby warm in her arms, and tried to process what he'd just said. Love. He loved her. The words should have terrified her, should have sent her running, but instead they settled over her like a blanket, unexpected comfort after years of cold. "I don't know if I love you yet," she said carefully. I think I might, but I'm afraid I can't trust my own judgment about these things. James seemed perfect at first, too, and look how that turned out. James was a liar who told you what you wanted to hear. I'm telling you the truth, even though it might make things uncomfortable between us. Caleb's voice was steady. And I'm telling you there's no rush, no pressure. Take a year if you need it. Take 5. I'll be here, building my ranch, living my life. And if someday you decide you want me in yours, I'll count myself the luckiest man in Montana territory. And if I never decide that, if I want to stay independent, then I'll still count myself lucky to know you, to watch you teach and build and change lives. He stood, settling his hat back on his head. Love doesn't have to lead anywhere specific, Eleanor. Sometimes it's enough just to feel it, to let it exist without demanding it transform into something else. After he left, Eleanor sat with baby Eleanor sleeping in her arms and let herself think about what loving Caleb Monroe might mean. It wouldn't be like loving James, desperate and needy and built on the fear of being alone. It would be choosing partnership from strength rather than weakness, sharing a life with someone who wanted her to be fully herself rather than a smaller, more manageable version. She thought she could do that. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday, when the fear had faded enough to let possibility through. September arrived with the crispness that promised autumn, and school began in earnest in the new building. Eleanor stood before 23 students on that first morning and felt the weight of responsibility settle across her shoulders like a familiar coat. These children were her purpose now, her contribution to a settlement that had given her back her life. She taught them reading and writing, mathematics and history, but also resilience and questioning and the importance of trusting their own instincts. She taught the girls especially that their minds mattered as much as their domestic skills, that they could be more than wives and mothers if they wanted, that the world was bigger than Silver Creek and they deserved to see all of it. Miss Eleanor is putting ideas in the girls' heads, John Morrison complained at a town meeting in October, teaching them to question their elders, to want more than what's good for them. Miss Eleanor is teaching them to think, Margaret Thornton shot back. If that threatens you, Mr. Morrison, perhaps you should examine why. The settlement sided with Eleanor, as she'd known they would. She'd proven herself useful, proven that education improved the community rather than disrupting it. And slowly, grudgingly, even the skeptics began to see value in having daughters who could read contracts and sons who could write business letters. In November, a letter arrived from Margaret Doyle with news that stopped Eleanor's heart. Margaret had found another woman, a third victim of James Whitford, living in Cheyenne under an assumed name because she was afraid her family would find out about her shame. The woman had a son, now 2 years old, and had been surviving through work as a laundress, but barely making enough to feed them both. Her name is Anna Miller, Margaret wrote. And she's drowning, Eleanor. She needs help. And I thought perhaps between your settlement and mine, we could offer her something better than slow starvation in Cheyenne. Eleanor brought the letter to Martha, who read it with her usual pragmatic assessment. Can Silver Creek take another woman and child? I think so. The settlement's growing, there's work available, and we've proven we know how to help women rebuild their lives. Eleanor paused. But it's not just about whether we can, it's about whether we should. How many women did James destroy? How many are still out there struggling alone because they're too ashamed to ask for help? Probably more than we'll ever know, but you can't save them all, Eleanor. No, but I can save the ones I know about. We can save them, if we work together. Martha smiled slowly. Then I suppose we'd better get to work. Anna Miller arrived in early December with her son clutching her skirts and terror in her eyes. Eleanor met her at the stage stop and saw herself 2 seasons ago, desperate, frightened, certain that one more blow would shatter her completely. You're safe now, Eleanor said, taking Anna's trembling hand. I know you don't believe me yet, but you will. You survived him, and that means you can survive anything. They found Anna work at the boarding house helping Mrs. Chen, who'd been complaining about having too much work since the settlement kept growing. Her son, a quiet boy named Peter, started attending school and slowly began to smile. And Anna, like Sarah before her, began to believe that maybe the worst was behind her. Christmas came with snow that transformed Silver Creek into something from a picture book. The church held a pageant where Eleanor's students performed, stumbling through their lines with earnest determination. Thomas, now walking and into everything, tried to join the performance and had to be gently redirected. And Caleb, sitting beside Eleanor in the pew, laughed at Thomas's antics with such genuine affection that several people exchanged knowing glances. After the service, as people gathered for cider and cookies, Margaret Thornton cornered Eleanor with the directness of someone too old to bother with subtlety. "That man is in love with you, and unless I'm completely blind, you're in love with him too. What are you waiting for?" Eleanor looked across the room to where Caleb was helping Thomas reach the cookie table, his large hands gentle as he lifted her son. "I'm waiting to be sure, to know it's real, and not just gratitude or loneliness or fear of being alone." "And how long will that take?" "I don't know. However long I need." Margaret's expression softened. "Eleanor, at some point you have to decide whether you're going to let James Whitford keep stealing your future or whether you're going to take it back. That man over there wants to give you everything James promised and never delivered. Don't let fear of the past rob you of something good in the present." The words stayed with Eleanor through the holidays, through the quiet weeks of January when school was suspended for weather and she had too much time to think. She found herself watching Caleb whenever he came to town, studying the way he moved through the world with quiet competence, the way he treated everyone with the same respectful dignity regardless of their station. He was nothing like James. The comparison was absurd, like comparing bedrock to quicksand, substance to shadow. But her heart still flinched at the thought of trusting a man again, of making herself vulnerable to that kind of betrayal. In February, on a day so cold the air hurt to breathe, Eleanor was walking home from the store when she saw a commotion near the saloon. A man she didn't recognize was arguing with Dr. Blake, his voice carrying anger and whiskey in equal measure. "I've got rights," the man was shouting. "That's my wife in there, and she's coming home with me whether she likes it or not." Eleanor's blood went cold. She hurried closer and recognized the woman cowering behind Dr. Blake, one of the homesteader's wives, a quiet woman with bruises she always blamed on clumsiness. "Your wife is under a doctor's care," Dr. Blake said firmly, "and she'll stay under my protection until she's well enough to make her own decisions about where she goes." "The hell she will. I'm her husband, and what I say goes." The man lunged for his wife, and Dr. Blake stepped between them. But the man was bigger, meaner, fueled by rage and alcohol. He shoved Dr. Blake aside and grabbed his wife's arm, yanking her forward hard enough to make her cry out. Then Caleb was there, materializing from somewhere with the swift efficiency of someone who'd handled violent men before. He caught the husband's wrist in one hand and twisted, forcing him to release his wife, then put himself between the man and his target with unmovable solidity. "That's enough," Caleb said quietly. "The lady doesn't want to go with you. You need to leave." "This isn't your business, Monroe." "Became my business when you put hands on someone who didn't want to be touched. Now you can walk away, or I can help you walk away. Your choice." The tension stretched taut as wire for a long moment. Then the husband spat at Caleb's feet and staggered off, muttering threats that everyone ignored. Dr. Blake guided his patient back inside while Caleb stood watch, making sure the man actually left. Eleanor approached slowly, her heart still hammering from the confrontation. "That was brave," she said. "That was necessary. Bravery doesn't enter into it." Caleb's jaw was tight with anger. Men like that think they own their wives, think they can do whatever they want because there's a piece of paper that says she's his property. Not all men think that way. No, but enough do that it's a problem. He looked at her directly. "Eleanor, I need you to know something. If we ever build something together, you would never be my property. You'd be my partner, my equal, someone I chose and who chose me back. And if you ever wanted to leave, I'd let you go, because love that holds someone against their will isn't love at all." Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest, some last defense she'd been holding against the possibility of him. Because here was the truth she'd been waiting for, not flowery promises or romantic declarations, but the fundamental respect that made real love possible. "I need to tell you something too," she said. "I've been afraid of you, not because you've given me reason to be, but because James taught me that men lie, that they promise one thing and deliver another, that love is just another word for control, and I've been waiting for you to reveal that you're just like him underneath all the kindness. And have I? No, you've been exactly who you claimed to be from the first moment. Patient, honest, respectful, kind. And that terrifies me more than if you'd been terrible, because it means I might actually get to have something good. And having something good means risking losing it. Caleb smiled, small and sad and understanding. Eleanor, you're going to lose me eventually one way or another. I'm going to die someday. Might be in 30 years. Might be tomorrow if my horse throws me wrong. That's the risk of loving anyone. But the alternative is living so afraid of loss that you never let yourself have anything worth losing in the first place. Is that what you did? After Sarah died? For 3 years, yes. Closed myself off. Convinced myself I was fine alone. Told myself it was better not to risk that kind of pain again. He met her eyes steadily. Then a storm brought you into my life, and I remembered what it felt like to care about someone, to want to build something with another person. And I realized I'd rather have 1 more year of that feeling than 30 more years of safety. Eleanor looked at this man who'd saved her life, who'd given her space to heal, who'd built his whole future around the possibility that someday she might be ready to love him back, and felt the last of her resistance crumble. I love you, she said, the words emerging with surprising ease. I've loved you for months, but I was too afraid to admit it. And I'm still afraid, but I'm more afraid of wasting the time we could have together because I'm trapped in the past. Caleb's expression transformed, joy breaking across his weathered face like sunrise. Say that again. I love you, Caleb Monroe. And if the offer's still open, I'd like to build a life with you. He kissed her there on the street in full view of anyone watching, and Eleanor kissed him back with the fierce certainty of someone who'd finally learned the difference between settling and choosing, between desperation and desire, between a man who took and a man who gave freely. When they finally broke apart, Martha was standing on the store porch with a knowing smile. About time, she called. I was beginning to think you'd both die of politeness before you figured it out. They were married in April, in the new schoolhouse with the whole settlement in attendance. Margaret Doyle traveled from Denver to stand with Eleanor, and Sarah Bennett held Thomas during the ceremony while baby Eleanor slept in Anna Miller's arms. The 3 women who'd survived James Whitford stood together as witnesses to what came after survival, the building of something better from the ruins he'd left behind. Eleanor wore a dress Martha's daughter had sent from Denver, simple but beautiful, and carried wildflowers from the first spring blooming. Caleb wore his best suit and looked at her like she was the answer to every question he'd ever asked. Robert Hayes performed the ceremony with genuine warmth, his earlier skepticism about Eleanor's character thoroughly revised. When he asked if anyone objected to the union, John Morrison stood, and Eleanor's heart stopped, but only to say gruffly that he'd been wrong about her, and Caleb was a lucky man. They exchanged vows Eleanor had written herself, promising partnership instead of obedience, respect instead of submission, choosing each other daily instead of once. And when Caleb slipped a simple gold band on her finger, Sarah's ring, offered freely because she would have wanted Eleanor to have it, Eleanor felt the weight of it as promise rather than prison. The celebration lasted into the evening, with food and dancing and toasts that grew progressively more emotional as the whiskey flowed. Thomas danced with Margaret Thornton, his small feet standing on her shoes while she waltzed him around the schoolhouse floor, and Eleanor danced with her husband, chosen and choosing her back, and felt something settle in her soul that had been restless since the night James rode away. Later, in the ranch house Caleb had built with rooms for Eleanor's books and Thomas's toys and the family they might someday grow, Eleanor stood at the window looking out at the Montana Territory stretching vast and beautiful under the stars. Caleb came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, and she leaned back into his solid warmth. Any regrets? He asked quietly. Only that I wasted so much time being afraid, but I suppose I needed that time to become someone worthy of this. She turned in his arms to face him. I was so broken when you found me, Caleb, so convinced I was damaged beyond repair. You were never broken, just lost for a while. His hand came up to cup her face with infinite tenderness. And even if you had been broken, Eleanor, broken things can be mended, can be made stronger at the places where they cracked. She kissed him then, pouring everything she couldn't say into the gesture, gratitude and love, and the fierce determination to build something lasting from the second chance they'd both been given. Outside, the wind carried the scent of sage and new grass, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its mate. The same wilderness that had nearly killed Eleanor now cradled her future. And she understood finally what Caleb had meant about the territory taking what it wanted, but leaving you with what mattered. James Whitford had taken her money, her trust, her belief in the promises people made. But the storm that brought her to Caleb had given her back something more valuable, herself, whole and strong and capable of choosing her own path. Years later, when Eleanor was old and Silver Creek had grown into a proper town, she would tell the story to her grandchildren, would tell them about the storm and the stranger who saved her, about the network of women who'd turned their shared pain into shared strength, about how the worst thing that ever happened to her had led directly to the best thing. The road that breaks you, she would say, watching their faces in the firelight, is sometimes the only one that leads you home. And Thomas, grown into a man who ran the ranch with his father's quiet competence, would add his own version, the one where his mother became a legend in the territory, known not for the husband who abandoned her, but for the school she built, the women she helped, the community she strengthened simply by refusing to let betrayal define her future. But on that April night, newly married and standing in her husband's arms with the whole future spread before her like uncharted country, Eleanor simply closed her eyes and let herself feel the peace of finally, truly being home. The storm had passed, the broken wheel had been mended with stronger wood, and the woman who'd been left behind in the mud had discovered that sometimes being abandoned was just another word for being set free.